Commander Velthor's claws scraped against the metal floor as he paced around his small apartment. The 3 moons of Kepler's station glowed through his window, but he couldn't focus on their beauty. Not tonight. Not when the memories came flooding. Back like a broken dam. The apartment was simple and clean, just like every other Coalition officer's quarters. A bed, a desk, a small kitchen unit, and that wall. A cursed wall covered with medals and certificates that meant nothing now. 30 years of service, 42 major battles, and 15 commendations for bravery. All of it felt hollow compared to what he had seen humans do during the war. Velthor stopped pacing and stared at his reflection in the dark window. His scales had turned a dull gray over the years, and his once bright yellow eyes now looked tired and old. He was 127 years. Old, ancient by most species standards, but still young for a Krillian. He should have decades of peaceful retirement ahead of him. Instead, he spent his nights reliving the horrors of war. The nightmare always started the same way. He was back on Vega Prime, leading his mixed-species platoon through the bombed-out ruins of what used to be the planet's capital city. The hegemony forces had been dug in for months, turning every building into a fortress. Coalition Command had given them an impossible mission: break through the enemy lines and secure the planetary defense grid. That's when he first met the humans. They arrived on a beat-up transport ship. 20 soldiers who looked nothing like the propaganda posters. No shining armor or advanced weapons. Tired faces, worn equipment, and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Their leader, Sergeant Kim Daeho, was a quiet man who barely spoke above a whisper. He had short, black hair, a thin scar running down his left cheek, and hands that never stopped moving, always checking his weapon or adjusting his gear. Sir Daeho had set an accented Coalition standard. "We're here to help with the breakthrough," Velthor remembered laughing. 20 humans against an entire hegemony division. It seemed like a joke. His platoon had 43 soldiers from 6 different species, all experienced veterans. What could 20 humans possibly add to their fighting strength? He found out during the first assault. The hegemony had set up a kill zone in the main square, with overlapping fields of fire from 3 different buildings. Coalition forces had been trying to cross that square for 2 weeks, losing dozens of soldiers in the process. But the humans just looked at it like it was a puzzle to be solved. "We'll go first," Daeho had said. "When you see the signal move, fast!" Velthor watched through his scope as the humans spread out along the edge of the square. They moved differently than other species. Not the calculated precision of the Arxan commandos or the brutal efficiency of the Theran warriors. They moved like they were part of the landscape itself, flowing from cover to cover like water finding the easiest path. Then something changed. He couldn't put his finger on exactly what happened. But in the span of a few seconds, the humans transformed. Their movements became faster, more coordinated. They started communicating without words, using hand signals and head nods that seemed to carry complex tactical information. Most disturbing of all, their facial expressions went completely blank. As if someone had turned off their emotions, the assault lasted exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds. Velthor had counted. By the time it was over, the 3 hegemony strongpoints had been eliminated, and the humans were already moving to secure the next objective. Not one of them had been seriously wounded, despite charging across open ground, under heavy fire. But it was what happened afterward that really haunted him. As the smoke cleared and the Coalition forces moved into the square, Velthor found Daeho sitting on a pile of rubble, staring at nothing. The human's hands were covered in blood, his uniform torn and scorched. But it was his eyes that made Velthor's scales crawl. They were completely empty, like looking into the void of space. "Hey, Corporal," Velthor had said. "Good work out there." Daeho turned to look at him, and for a moment, Velthor thought he was looking at a machine instead of a living being. There was no recognition, no emotion, no humanity in those dark eyes. Just cold calculation. Then, like a switch being flipped, Daeho blinked and became human again. He smiled, nodded politely, and went back to cleaning his weapon. But Velthor never forgot that moment of transformation. Now, decades later, sitting. In his quiet apartment, Velthor rubbed his temples and tried to push the memories away. The war was over. The hegemony had been defeated. Humanity had been welcomed into the coalition as heroes and liberators. So why couldn't he stop thinking about what he had seen? The computer terminal on his desk chimed softly, indicating an incoming message. Velthor ignored it. He had been retired for 5 years now. He had no interest in whatever administrative nonsense Coalition Command wanted to burden him with. But the memories wouldn't leave him alone. Every night he dreamed of Deho's empty eyes. Every morning he woke up with questions that had no answers. What had he really witnessed during those final battles? What were the humans hiding behind their modest smiles and quiet efficiency? The computer chimed again, more insistently this time. Velthor sighed and activated the display. The message was from his old friend, Admiral Kexton, asking if he would be interested in consulting on a new military history project about human combat tactics. Velthor stared at the message for a long time. Maybe it was time to stop running from his questions and start looking for answers. He had military clearance, connections throughout the coalition, and nothing but time on his hands. His claws hovered over the keyboard as he made his decision. Whatever secrets the humans were hiding, he was going to find them, even if it meant diving into the darkest corners of classified military archives. Computer Access Military Archives. Authorization Veltha 77 Alpha. The holographic display flickered to life, casting blue light across his weathered features. He had been putting this off for months, but the dreams were getting worse. He needed to understand what he had witnessed during those final battles. Of the Galactic Liberation War, Search, Human Combat Performance, Vega Prime Campaign. Dozens of files appeared, most heavily classified. As he scrolled through the reports, one designation kept appearing. Asterisk, asterisk, protocol, Crimson classified, beyond coalition clearance, asterisk, asterisk. His mandibles clicked nervously. In 30 years of military service, he had never encountered a classification level that high. The journey to Epsilon Cygni took 3 days through hyperspace, but Velthor barely noticed the time passing. His mind kept replaying the classified files he had managed to access before the system locked him out. What he had seen, in those brief moments before the security protocols kicked in, was enough to make his scales turn pale with fear. Epsilon Cygni Transit Station was a massive structure, bigger than most cities. Ships from across the galaxy docked here daily, bringing traders, diplomats, refugees, and mercenaries from every corner of known space. The main concourse buzzed with activity as thousands of beings went about their business under the artificial sky of the station's central dome. Velthor stood near the arrival gates, watching the crowds flow past him like a river of different species. Tall, graceful Zanari, with their crystalline skin, caught the light as they glided through the terminal. Stocky Borthok miners stomped past in their heavy boots, their tusks gleaming under the station's bright lights. A group of insectoid Vexri clicked and chittered as they negotiated with a merchant selling exotic spices. But he was looking for one specific. Human Lieutenant Park Minji had been harder to track down than he expected. The human military kept excellent records of their active personnel. But finding retired veterans was like searching for a single grain of sand on a beach. It had taken him 2 weeks of calling in favors and following paper trails before he finally located her working as a security consultant on this remote station. Then he saw her. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, avoiding the main traffic flows and keeping to the shadows along the walls. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, streaked with gray, that made her look older than her 35 standard years. She wore civilian clothes, but Velthor could see the military training in every step she took. Her eyes constantly scanned the area around her, cataloging threats and escape routes with automatic precision. What struck him most was how the other beings unconsciously moved out of her way, not because she was pushing through the crowd, but because something about her presence made them step aside without even realizing it. It was like watching predators give way to an apex hunter. Velthor followed her at a distance. As she made her way to the commercial district, she entered a small cafe tucked between a weapons shop and a neural interface dealer. The place was dimly lit and mostly empty. It's perfect for a conversation that needed to stay private. He waited 5 minutes before going in, giving her time to choose her seat and position herself where she could watch the entrance. When he finally entered, she was sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall, a cup of coffee already in front of her.
Oh.
"You shouldn't have contacted me," she said, without looking up as he approached her table. Velthor slid into the seat across from her. Noting how her hands stayed visible on the table, but within easy reach of what he assumed was a concealed weapon. "Lieutenant Park, I need to discuss something with you." "Former lieutenant," she corrected, finally meeting his eyes. "I left the service 3 years ago. Whatever you think I can tell you, you're probably wrong. It's about Vega Prime. It's about what happened during the final assault." Minji's expression didn't change, but Velthor saw her fingers tighten slightly around her coffee cup. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You were there," Velthor pressed. "You were part of the medical team attached to Sergeant Kim Daeho's unit. I have the deployment records." "Records can be wrong." She took a sip of her coffee, but he noticed her hands trembling slightly. "Besides, even if I was there, everything that happened is classified, way above your clearance level, Commander." "I need to know what happened to Daeho and the others," Velthor said, leaning forward. "I was there too. I saw things that don't make sense. Things that contradict everything we know about human physiology and psychology." Minji set down her cup and studied his face for a long moment. "Some doors shouldn't be opened, Commander. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share." "I was there," Velthor repeated, his voice getting stronger. "I saw what your people did. 36 hours of continuous combat. No food, no rest. Daeho took 7 plasma bolts to the chest and kept fighting. Your medic, Lee Hoyan-woo, performed surgery on himself while under enemy fire. That's not normal." "Normal?" Minji laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was bitter and hollow, like something breaking. "Nothing about us is normal. You think you want to know the truth? You think you can handle what really happened? Out there?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You want to know what Protocol Crimson is? It's what happens when humans stop pretending to be civilized. It's what happens when we let the monster out of its cage." Velthor felt his heart beating faster. "What monster? The one that's been hiding inside us since we crawled out of the caves on Earth? The one that helped us survive ice ages and plagues and wars that should have wiped us out completely." Minji's eyes had taken on a distant look, as if she was seeing something far away. "We call it going dark. When pushed beyond our breaking point, something ancient wakes up inside us. Something our species has been trying to evolve past for millennia." "I don't understand," Velthor said, though part of him was beginning to. "Of course you don't. Your species never had to fight for survival the way we did. You developed intelligence and cooperation. You built civilizations and formed alliances. But humans were different. We're the species that looked at a planet full of predators and decided to become the apex predator."
Oh.
Minji paused to take another sip of coffee, but her hands were steadier now. Talking about it seemed to calm her in a way that was almost more disturbing than her previous nervousness. "Daeho didn't survive those plasma wounds because he was tough," she continued. "He survived because his brain shut down everything non-essential. Pain, fear, conscious thought, even basic self-preservation. His body became a machine with one purpose: kill everything that threatened his pack." Velthor's blood ran cold. "Pack. That's what we've become, Commander. Not soldiers, not people. We've become wolves. A pack of predators working together with perfect coordination and absolute ruthlessness." She smiled, and for a moment, Velthor saw something predatory in her expression. Lee Hoyan-woo didn't perform surgery on himself because he was brave. He did it because the pack needed him functional, and pain was just an inconvenience to be ignored. But how is that possible? The medical reports I saw suggested injuries that should have been fatal, because when we go dark, we don't follow the normal rules anymore. Our bodies start producing chemicals that shouldn't exist. Our brains form new neural pathways in real time. Our muscles and bones temporarily restructure themselves for maximum efficiency. Minji's voice was getting quieter, but somehow more intense. We become something that evolution never intended, but that survival demanded. The cafe seemed to have gotten quieter around them, as if the other patrons could sense the weight of their conversation. Velthar looked around and noticed that several beings had moved to tables further away, though they probably couldn't. "Explain why. How many humans can do this?" he asked. "All of us," Minji said simply. "Every single human carries the genetic potential. Most never trigger it because they never face the right kind of extreme stress. But in war, with lives on the line and no other options, that's when the monster wakes up. And afterward, what happens when the battle is over?" Minji's expression grew dark. "That's the real problem, isn't it? Some of us come back. We return to being regular people, with regular jobs and regular lives, but others?" She shook her head. "Others never fully return. They stay partially dark, partially wolf. They function in society, but they're always hunting, always calculating, always ready to kill." She finished her coffee and stood up. "I've told you too much already. Forget what I said, Commander. Go back to your retirement and enjoy your peace. Because if you keep digging into this, you're going to find things that will make you wish you'd never met our species." As she walked away, Velthar called after her, "Minji, wait. What happened to the others? What happened to Deho?" She stopped at the cafe entrance and looked back at him. "Deho. He's still out there somewhere, still fighting his own private war. And every night he dreams of going dark again. Because once you taste that kind of power, once you feel what it's like to be the perfect predator, everything else feels like pretending." Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd, like she had never been there at all. Velthar sat alone in the dimly lit cafe, staring at the empty coffee cup she had left behind. Had realized that his investigation had only just begun. The journey to Titan took longer than Velthar expected, a massive research facility orbiting. Saturn's largest moon was hidden behind layers of security that would make a military fortress jealous. He had to call in favors from 3 different admirals and promise his silence to 2 intelligence directors, just to get clearance for a single visit. The shuttle that carried him from the main transport hub was unmarked and piloted by a silent human who never spoke during the 2-hour flight. Through the viewport, Velthar could see the facility growing larger as they approached. It looked like a giant metal spider clinging to the surface of Titan's smaller moon, its legs extending deep into the rocky surface. "Impressive, isn't it?" said a voice behind him as they docked. Velthar turned to see a small human woman waiting at the airlock. She was maybe 5 feet tall, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a simple white lab coat. It was her eyes that caught his attention. They looked ancient, as if they had seen things that aged the soul faster than the body. "Dr. Kang?" "I served with the Admiral during the Proxima campaign," Velthar replied. "We've been through some difficult situations together." "Difficult situations?" Dr. Kang repeated, with a small smile. "That's one way to put it. I imagine you've seen humans in combat before, Commander." They stopped at a reinforced door, marked with warning symbols in 12 different languages. Dr. Kong placed her palm on a scanner and spoke a code phrase in what sounded like ancient Korean. The door slid open with a heavy mechanical sound. "What you're about to see," she said quietly as they entered, "is why the Coalition victory came at such a high cost. Not in resources or lives, but in what we learned about ourselves." The room beyond was vast, filled with holographic displays and data storage units that hummed with barely contained energy. Along the walls were sealed observation chambers, each one labeled with codes that meant nothing to Velthar. The air smelled of ozone and something else he couldn't identify, something that made his scales crawl with unease. "This facility was built 5 years ago," Dr. Kang explained as she led him to a central viewing area. "After the war ended and we started analyzing combat footage, we realized we had documented something that shouldn't exist. Human soldiers performing feats that defied every law of biology and psychology we knew." She activated a holographic display, and suddenly the air around them filled with 3-dimensional combat footage. Velthar found himself standing in the middle of a battlefield, watching human soldiers fight with an intensity that made his blood freeze. The first video file showed combat footage from the Battle of Kepler 44b, a human sergeant. His uniform, identifying him as Choi Jae-sung, is advancing through enemy fire when a plasma cannon blast took off his entire left arm at the shoulder. Velthar expected to see the man fall, screaming in pain and shock. Instead, Sergeant Choi barely paused. He shifted his rifle to his remaining hand and continued firing with impossible accuracy, each shot finding its target despite the chaos around him. His face showed no pain, no fear, no recognition that he had just suffered a wound that should have been instantly fatal. "Watch his eyes," Dr. Kong said softly. Velthar looked closer and saw what she meant. Choi's eyes were completely empty, like looking into the void of space. There was no consciousness there, no humanity, just cold, calculating awareness, focused entirely on eliminating threats. In the background of the same footage, another soldier, Private Yoon Seo-jun, was moving through the battlefield with mechanical precision. He wasn't just fighting. He was systematically executing wounded enemy soldiers, checking each body with clinical efficiency before moving to the next target. There was no emotion in his movements, no hesitation or mercy. Combat dissociation, Dr. Kang explained. Human stress hormones exceed critical thresholds. Our consciousness essentially steps aside. What you're seeing is the human autonomic nervous system operating at maximum efficiency. Without the interference of conscious thought or emotion, the hologram shifted to show new footage, this one even more disturbing. Squad leader Han Ji-ho was leading an assault through a narrow corridor filled with toxic gas that should have killed any living being within seconds. His entire squad followed behind him, moving in perfect synchronization, despite having no visual contact with each other through the poisonous fog. They moved like a single entity, each soldier knowing exactly where the others were without looking. When one soldier encountered resistance, the others immediately shifted to support positions they couldn't possibly have seen. When Ji-ho raised his hand to signal a halt, every member of his squad stopped at exactly the same moment, as if they shared a single nervous system. How is that possible? Velthar whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the equipment. Around them, we don't fully understand it ourselves, Dr. Kong admitted. Battlefield telepathy, we call it. When humans enter the dissociative state together, they seem to develop a form of shared consciousness. Individual identity disappears, and they become something else entirely. Something else. Dr. Kong's expression grew haunted as she watched the footage replay. A single organism with multiple bodies. A predator perfectly adapted for warfare. She changed the display again, showing brain scans and genetic analysis data. The readings were unlike anything Velthar had ever seen. Neural activity patterns that shouldn't exist, hormone levels that should have been instantly fatal, and genetic expressions that seemed to activate and deactivate in real time. "This is Sergeant Kim Dae-ho," Dr. Kong said, highlighting one particular set of data. "I believe you served with him on Vega Prime." Velthar's heart skipped a beat. "You have recordings of Dae-ho. We have everything, Commander. Every biometric. Reading every combat engagement, every moment of transformation." The data swirled around them in three-dimensional glory, showing the moment when a normal human soldier became something else entirely. Watch what happens to his brain activity when the combat dissociation begins. The neural scan showed normal human patterns at first, the complex waves and rhythms of conscious thought and emotion. Then, as the stress indicator spiked beyond normal levels, everything changed. Large portions of the brain simply went dark, shutting down non-essential functions. But other areas, primitive regions that most humans never accessed, suddenly blazed with activity. It's like watching evolution. In reverse, Dr. Kong said quietly, the civilized human disappears, and something ancient takes its place. Something that remembers when we were predators fighting for survival in a world that wanted to kill us. How long does it last? Velthar asked. That depends on the individual and the circumstances. Some soldiers snap back to normal consciousness within minutes of the threat ending. Others stay in the dissociative state for days or weeks. She paused, looking troubled. and some never fully come back. The holographic display shifted again, showing footage of human soldiers after battles had ended. Velthar watched in growing horror as men and women who had been efficient killing machines just hours before struggled to remember their own names or recognize their friends. Some sat staring at nothing, their minds still lost in the dark place they had descended to during combat. The psychological trauma is extensive, Dr. Kong continued. But it's not just trauma in the traditional sense. These soldiers have literally become different people during combat. When they return to normal consciousness, they retain memories of actions they took while dissociated, but they can't connect emotionally with those memories. What do you mean? Imagine watching a recording of yourself committing acts of violence so efficient and ruthless that they terrify you, but having no memory of the emotions or thoughts that led to those actions. You know you did these things, but it feels like watching a stranger wearing your face. Velthar felt sick. How many humans are capable of this? All of them, Dr. Kang said simply. Every human carries the genetic potential for combat dissociation. Most never trigger it because they never face the right combination of extreme stress and mortal danger. But under the right circumstances, any human can become the perfect killer. She led him to another section of the archive, where sealed chambers lined the walls like tombs. Each one contained monitoring equipment and what looked like medical restraints. These are our observation chambers, she explained. We've been studying volunteers who agreed to controlled dissociation experiments. We're trying to understand the mechanisms involved and find ways to help soldiers return to normal consciousness more quickly. Volunteers? Velthar asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. War veterans who never fully came back from their dissociative states. They live in a permanent twilight between human and predator, never quite able to reconnect with normal society. For them, these experiments represent a chance to either return to full humanity or at least understand what they've become. The implications hit Velthar like a physical blow. Thousands of human soldiers had returned from the war forever changed, carrying within them the capacity for inhuman violence. They were walking among civilian populations, trying to pretend they were normal people while harboring the instincts of apex predators. Dr. Kang, he said slowly, what happens if these soldiers can't control their dissociative states? What happens if they go dark in civilian settings? Her silence was answer enough. The transport ship that carried Velthar to Mars colony was filled with the usual mix of traders, tourists, and settlers looking for a new life on the Red Planet. But as they approached the massive terraforming domes that covered New Sol City, Velthar couldn't shake the feeling that he was flying into something far more dangerous than a simple research visit by Mars had changed dramatically since the war ended. What started as a small mining outpost had grown into one of humanity's largest colonies, with millions of people living under the protective atmospheric domes. The skyline was a mix of gleaming towers and industrial complexes, all connected by transport tubes that snaked between the domes like giant metal arteries.